Okay. All right, so as Mike said, my name is Levi Zitting. I'm kind of a newbie to the group. I've only been coming for like 2 or 3 months. So I met some of you I haven't yet met, but I'd love to. So come talk to me afterwards, say hi. And questions, we'll save some time at the end for some questions, but also afterwards if you want to talk to me, that's totally fine as well. So tonight we're talking about Vue.js, and I've kind of split this talk into 2 halves, if you will. The first, we're going to go over some real basics of Vue, just how to use it, how to get set up with a project, and then kind of the other half is maybe for people who've used Vue a little bit more and want to do some more advanced things. So we're going to look at like how to set up Webpack processes, not processes, but build processes, and maybe do like code splitting and stuff with Vue. So we'll get into that kind of the latter half. And if we have time, I have some other niceties to throw in there, like how to use Vue with TypeScript, which I'm a huge fan of. So we'll get into that if we have time. So let's talk a little bit about like the history of Vue. Vue has been around for 2 or 3 years, maybe almost 4. And it was originally created by Evan You, and he's still the maintainer of the project today. He created Vue.js while he was working at Google as kind of a little helper library because he didn't want to use full-on Angular for some projects. And it started gaining some traction on GitHub, and eventually he decided to work on Vue full-time. So he actually completely runs off donations on his Patreon campaign. So if you want to support the Vue.js project, number 1, get on GitHub and submit a pull request. There's lots of open issues and lots of people willing to help you get into contributing. And then also you can go contribute to his Patreon campaign. So now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and like get kind of in depth with Vue here. So I'm going to do a little bit of like live coding and show you some of the features. And the easiest way to get set up and like start creating Vue.js projects is using the Vue CLI tool, which is just an npm package that you would install globally on your machine. So npm install -g Vue CLI, and it just gives you a command on your oh, whoops. Hey, this might mess up the stream. I'm gonna. It's not on my screen now. Still nothing? No. It's good? Okay, there we go. Oh, but you guys, what the heck is going on here? Well, let me do this. It's putting like one screen up here, then the other on here, or turning one of them off. It's not like mirroring. Try this. Well, I might just have to do it this way. I'm just going to like try and do it with my laptop screen off. This is going to be interesting. Okay, this kind of works for me. So, okay, we'll just try this. Okay, so when you install the npm package globally on your machine, you have access to a Vue command. So, and the main thing that it does is scaffold new projects for you. So you can just run Vue and then an init command, and then you basically pass it a template. And it comes with a bunch of templates built in, stuff for working with Browserify, Webpack, or there's just a real simple template as well. And that's the first one that we're going to mess with. So I'm going to... Okay, so it's going to generate the simplest Webpack or not Webpack, but Vue configuration that it possibly can. Which, if we go ahead and open up a text editor here, the simplest possible configuration for Vue is just a single HTML file. So if we go ahead and just like jump into this HTML file, and we'll look at how Vue is being pulled in and then how we use it. So up at the top here, we're pulling in Vue from Unpackage, which if you've never heard of Unpackage, it's just an NPM mirror for pulling scripts and CSS files in over HTTPS. So the Vue library is being added in our web page right here. And then we have a bunch of markup, which we're going to kind of skip over for now. And then down at the bottom, we have a script tag where we're actually writing a little bit of Vue.js code. So, and can you guys see this font okay? Okay. Increase it just a little bit. Is that better? Okay. All right, so the first thing that we do is we initialize Vue by running new Vue. And you actually don't even have to tie it to a variable like they're doing right here, but you can if you need to reference it inside of the console later. If you're like doing, or not just reference it inside the console, but if you need to somehow reference it later, you can. But it's sort of redundant too, because you don't end up needing to access the Vue instance outside of it. So it just takes this one object literal that is kind of the configuration for your Vue.js instance, and it's really where all of our code ends up living. The first property that you'll always pass your root instance, if you will, is this L property, short for element. And you just pass it a CSS selector. So this hash app is short for something with an ID of app. And if we scroll up in our markup, the very first thing we see is we have an element with an ID of app. So this L property binds our Vue.js instance to a element inside of our HTML. Then we have this data object, and this data object, we drop data in here that we would need elsewhere in our Vue instance. So if we were defining some methods, which we'll look at in a second, and we need to reference some data, you'll drop it in right there. And also inside of our templates, which our templates are the markup that's inside of that root element. If we need to reference data inside there, this is where we would define it. And then next we have methods, which are just a list of methods defined on our instance that we can once again reference throughout the instance. So if we go back up and look at this template, Vue has a really simple kind of templating language. If you've ever worked with Angular or React, it's not necessarily similar to React, but it's pretty close to Angular's. So if we look through this markup, the first thing that we see that doesn't necessarily look like normal HTML is these double curly braces here, also known as like mustache syntax. And the double curly braces is interpolation. So what's happening is we're interpolating the value of greeting in between these two h1 tags. So if we open this up in the browser, we'll see a heading with the value of greeting, which it's set to just a simple string. And then if we come down a little bit more, we see the same thing again, but this time it's a method that we're referencing, and we're passing it a separate data value. So right in here, we're mixing methods and data together, and this method, humanize URL, it just returns a string without HTTP or a trailing / in it, so it looks a little nicer on the front end. And then the other little bit of code that doesn't look like normal HTML necessarily is this colon just before the href. And this is data binding. So Vue.js, it's actually short for a directive known as vbind. And if you've never heard of directives, they're in other front-end frameworks like React and Angular. But directives are a way to, they're custom HTML attributes that when you add them, they perform some type of functionality provided by the framework. So for instance, there's a conditional directive, so like vif, where it checks if a statement is true, and if it is, then it will render out our element. But this vbind, what's happening right here is we're binding to this anchor tag's href attribute the value of docs.url, which is a property inside of our data object. So vbind is binding to it. When everything's rendered out on the front end, we'll have a normal href tag with the value of docs.url injected in between right there, so it works like a normal link. So now, let me look at some notes here. So next, let's look at computed properties. So sometimes you need a value inside of your Vue.js instance that some kind of computation needs to happen before you get the value. Maybe a really simple example is, let's say we want to like reverse this greeting right here and reference it somewhere else. But then if greeting ever changes, that kind of reversed greeting needs to be changed as well. And Vue can handle that through computed properties. So computed properties are special methods that you define in your Vue.js instance that are just functions that return some type of value. So if I say computed, and let's just do that reversed greeting real quick. So I'll say reversed greeting is a function that returns this dot greeting. So right here we're referencing the greeting that we defined in our data object, and then we say dot split dot reverse and then dot join. Okay, so that's just a simple way to reverse a string in JavaScript. And then if we come up here to our template, we can reference this reversed greeting as a property instead of as a method, like it's defined. So I could just say paragraph tag and then put reversed greeting in there. And let's go ahead and open this up in a browser so we can see what the rendered output looks like. Sweet, thank you. Okay, and then there's our like string reversed right there. And if some part of our app was changing that greeting value, Vue would automatically know to rerun that reversed greeting function to get its computed property. So that's computed properties. And also, if you ever end up using like a state management tool, which Vue has one called Vuex, and I've messed around with it a little bit here or there, you end up using computed properties a lot. So next, let's jump into, as I mentioned, there's directives like vif. Whoops. So that's how you would conditionally show something. So if I say vif, and then, whoops, you have to have a dash right here, v-if. And then if you run some type of conditional in there, like 3 is greater than 2, which would be true, then it will show this. But if that was false, it would completely hide the element it would completely remove the element from our page. And there's another directive that works very similar called vshow, but with the main difference being that vif completely removes the element that, if the condition is false, vif completely removes the element from our DOM, while vshow just sets its display to none. So if you're using vif to swap large pieces of your app out, or if you need to conditionally swap like large pieces of your app, it'd be a better idea to use vif because it won't even be in your DOM taking up memory. It'll just be sitting inside Vue's kind of virtual DOM, waiting to be rendered out when it needs to be. Okay. Another directive that you'll use fairly often if you ever start using Vue is v-for, which is just a for loop to create lots and lots of elements over and over again. So if I say, just have a little paragraph tag here, and we'll just, in our data object, let's create a simple list of names. We'll make this names attribute, we'll use Tom because he's not here, and Ben, something. So we have this array of names, and then to use v-for to render out a paragraph tag for each and every single name, we just say v-for, and then we inline kind of create a variable that we want to use to reference each of those names on every iteration. So that's what name is right here. And then we say in names. And then inside of this element, we have access to this name variable that we just kind of created in line. And on every iteration of the loop, name will be equal to the current iteration through. Whoops. Do that a lot. Oh, whoops. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So there's v4. Let's see. Another thing you'll need to do in your templates and throughout your Vue.js is bind to events. So Vue has another directive called v-on, where you can bind to really any of the built-in browser events. So if I have a button here, let's create a little simple counter example, and then we'll have a count variable or a count property. I remember the comma this time. So to create a event, you just use, like I said, v-on, and a couple of the Vue directives can take sort of an argument, which is what comes after the colon right here. So in that v-bind example I was talking about, you're using the v-bind directive, and then you're passing it some kind of argument, like the href property, or if you were, let's say, putting an image on the screen and you were trying to bind to the image source, you would do colon source, or src. So with v-on, we do the same thing, except we pass it the name of the event we want to bind to. So right here, we're binding to a click, and then we just write a little bit of code to say what happens every time we click. So we just simply update the count. And if we come down here, our little +1 button runs a counter. Pretty simple. A simple example, but it shows what how the events work. And then there's kind of some syntactical sugar on top of the v-on directive, where you can replace v-on and the colon with just an @ symbol, because you end up writing a lot of events throughout your template. Also, it just makes it a little easier to see at a glance where your events are, because you don't use the @ symbol a lot necessarily. And then the last big kind of built-in Vue directive is vmodel. So you can probably consider a scenario where you want to listen to an event in like an input box and take the value from the input box and bind it to some data property. So you'll have an event that will update a data property, and then elsewhere in your app, Vue.js would take care of binding that to elements. But on initial render, maybe the value that the event is updating needs to be bound back into that text box. So, which gets a little complicated. It's not super complicated, but there's a lot of work. You have to write an event and also bind. So there's the vmodel directive is meant to kind of mitigate that and make handling this two-way binding a lot easier. So if we have an input box with a type of text, we can add vmodel to it and just give it a name of some data property. So I'm just going to use name on its own down here. And we'll set name equal to my name initially. And I'm also going to echo it out somewhere else. And if we go and look at our application, oh goodness. On initial render, what was initially in name is bound into our input property automatically. But then also, if we put someone else's name in here, which this might be a little hard to see with the small font size, but if we put Tom, who's not here right now, in there, it's automatically updating like as I type, because it's listening for a change event on that input and automatically updating the property that we bound into vmodel. So vmodel is really just short for binding into an element and also creating an event to update that binding on every change. Okay, now, so those are all kind of like the built-in directives that you'll use inside your template. libraries that you use can actually add extra directives. So you're not limited to just these, but these are the ones that come built in. So I'm going to go ahead and erase everything that we've done because it's worthless. But also because we're going to take a look at another example real quick. So another big part of Vue is components. And that's a big part of almost any front-end framework, is writing components. And I really like writing components, especially with Vue. Once we get into some more of the kind of advanced stuff where we add a build process, you can do some really nifty things with components. But a component is kind of a core part of a front-end framework. And Vue has really good tools to build your components. And another thing that I didn't mention right at the beginning, but I'll mention now, is that Vue is they call it the progressive framework, because it's really easy to incrementally adopt the best practices of Vue. You can start by just simply dropping that script tag somewhere in your website and start writing little tiny Vue components here or there. And then as you keep going, you could upgrade more and more of your app to Vue, where you decide you finally should start adding a build process to make things easier. So that's kind of another huge selling point of Vue, is it's very incrementally adoptable. So we're going to go ahead and create a component. So I'll show you how to. There's several ways to create components with Vue, and we're going to start with kind of the easiest. So the easiest way to create a component is to say Vue.component, and it's just a function that takes two parameters. The first is a string with the name of the component. So I'm going to re-implement our little counter example. So I'm going to say my counter. And then the second argument is an object literal, just like our initial Vue instance took. And it has almost all of the same properties. You can add data, you can add methods, add computed properties. The main difference is that, well, there's two kind of main caveats. The first is that you need a template property. And there's several things you can bind to this template property. First, you can just set it equal to a string, which is the easiest way to get started and how we're going to do it. But you can also add a template tag with an ID inside of your HTML, and then you can just give it a string, give the template property a string with that ID, and at runtime, Vue will go grab the template from your markup. But in this scenario, we're just going to bind it to a string really quick. And I'm using the string literals in ES 2015 or whatever added it, so that we can do like multi-line strings without any funky backslashes. So that was the first main caveat, and I'm going to write just a simple little bit here, and then we'll get into the second big one. So our counter, we needed a paragraph tag that put the result of our count onto the screen. So we'll say count. And then we also needed a button to actually run the increment. And then lastly, we needed an event to update that count. And I'm going to move this into its own method, and we'll see why in a few minutes. So I'm just going to say an add method or something like that. Okay, so that's our template. The other kind of big caveat when you're dealing with Vue components is that your data object can't just be an object. It has to be a function that returns an object. I'm actually not sure why this is. I've tried looking around to see why they make us do this, but it's just something you have to live with Vue, is that your inside components, your data property must be a function that returns an object. And then we'll go ahead and define our count inside of here, just like we would in the root instance. And then we'll define a method called add. And it will just set the count equal to 1. And our methods object does not have to be a function that returns an object. It's just the data. Computed properties also don't have to do that, just the data object. Okay, so now we've created our component, and when you use this syntax of Vue.component, it becomes a global component. So you can use that in any Vue.js instance throughout your application. And to use it, you just go into your markup and add a custom HTML tag with the name that you define. So I defined my counter, so I just add my counter into our HTML. And then if I come over here and refresh everything, we should have our counter there. And I can make multiple copies of this, and they'll all manage their own state. They won't get mixed up whose count they're worrying about. So they're all siloed off like that. But lots of times you run into scenarios where you need to pass data into your components. And there's two kind of big ways to do that. If you need to pass markup into your components, you would use what's known as a slot. So you can just add a slot tag inside of your components markup. And what that allows us to do is in between the tags of our component, we can just start writing markup. So I can say first counter. And if we refresh, there's an H1 inside only our first component. And on the rest of them, since we didn't actually define anything to go into that slot, it doesn't put anything there. And then when you need to pass data into your components, not just markup, you would end up using props. I think it's short for properties. But for your component to accept a prop, you have to define which props it will accept inside of your component's configuration, or inside your component's object literal. And it's just a property called props, and it's just an array of strings of the props that you want to accept. So we're going to accept an increment prop that will define how much we want each counter to increment by. So inside of our markup, when we're using it, all we have to do is just add an increment attribute with how many we want to increment by. So this is how you bind props into components. And then below, right here, this is how your components accept props. So now inside of our application, we're going to use increments. So right here, when we increment the counter, instead of adding it by 1, we're going to parse int the increment. Vue adds any of our props onto this keyword so that you can access them inside of methods or even inside of data properties as well. And then up here in our markup, we're going to change this +1. I do? Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, increment. So now if we refresh, it's kind of hard to see, but this one says +1, this one says +2, and this one says +3. And this one goes up by 3, this one goes up by 2, and this one goes up by 1. So props, that's how you would bind data into your components, and then props is how you would bind data into your components, and then if your components need specific markup, you would use slots instead of like trying to bind a string of HTML. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of components. There's a lot more that you can do with them. A component can emit custom events that a parent component could be listening for. We're not going to get into that too much because I want to get into some other stuff first. But this is kind of the most basic example of a component. And then another thing that I wanted to touch on was lifecycle hooks. And lifecycle hooks are special functions that Vue will run at some point in a component's lifecycle. So components have a lifecycle where they're initially created, then they also have a point in their life where they're mounted into the DOM. They also can be destroyed, so they have a part in their life where they are destroyed. Components get updated every so often when data changes, so there's a part in their life where they're being updated. And Vue allows you to tie custom logic into at these event times. So for instance, the created lifecycle hook to do some kind of functionality, like for instance, let's say I have a component with some data properties, and these data properties need to be populated by an AJAX call coming back. And that's going to happen later, but we want the AJAX call to like be sent off right when the component is created. So we would have just a created property on here that's a function. Whoops. And this function will just go ahead and console.log. Hello, nothing crazy. But this function will get run as soon as the component is created and loaded in memory, but before it's mounted into the DOM. There's a separate lifecycle event for mounted. So you would just, if you wanted to bind into mounted, you would just add another property called mounted and make it a function, and you'd write your logic or whatever there. There's a couple other, like, I think it's before updated. I don't have all the lifecycle hooks memorized, but you can just search Vue lifecycle hooks and you'd get the list of 4 or 5 that Vue has built in. Okay, so that's all the basics that we're going to do with this kind of simple example and kind of the basics of Vue. There's more to the library than this, but kind of once you know these basics, you can start building things with Vue. Next, we're going to kind of take a look at how to use Webpack with Vue so that you can take advantage of what are called single file Vue components, which are my favorite thing I've ever come across, honestly. So we're going to go ahead and say HTML. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and use the Vue CLI to set up a whole Webpack process for us. So I'm just going to say Vue init Webpack. And there's 2 different Webpack templates. There's Webpack and Webpack Simple. And we're going to start off by just using Webpack Simple. And it just asks us a couple questions, just like it did before. We're going to say no to that. And then we'll just install our dependencies real quick. I do this a lot. Just waiting on dependencies. Okay, so here's kind of the basic, this is what Vue, or the Vue CLI just set up for us. We have a couple of configuration files, specifically one for Babel, so it's using Babel to transpile for us. A couple others. Then we also have this index.html file. And this is really simple. We pull in that kind of our built bundle of JavaScript right here. And that's pretty much it. Everything else for this little example app that they spun up, we would all write in our JavaScript. And then the last kind of big file is our Webpack config, which we don't need to go into because that's really complicated, and it took care of it for us. So let's start looking at some of the features that you can start using once you add a Webpack build process. So inside of our source, we have this main.js. And the first thing that we do inside of main is we import Vue, and we did that in our index.html just with a script tag instead. So we're importing Vue, and then we import this app. We import app from app.vue. This is kind of like a component right here. So we're importing a component from this .vue file, and then we kind of do the same thing that we did before, except for there's this render property that's a arrow function, and it's not super clear what it does, kind of based on what it generated for us. But if we replace this h with create element, which is the actual name of the function that it's running, what's happening here is Vue is binding itself to our DOM through that L app, and then it's creating an element based on our app component, an actual HTML element, and then injecting that into app. So that's what that render part is taking care of. Another thing that I've seen people do instead of this render is just say template is like app. And that works pretty much the same way, except for that there's one difference. There's actually 2 versions of Vue that you can install when you're using NPM. Well, not 2 versions that you can install, but 2 versions that you can use. There's Vue with the runtime, and there's Vue with the runtime and the compiler. And the compiler, when you write your HTML templates, Vue actually goes through and converts your template to what they call raw render functions. If you're familiar with React, you may have heard of these, but essentially instead of, you know how I used to do it when I was trying to inject HTML into a web page, is I would set the inner HTML equal to a string of like raw HTML. But how React and Vue do it is they have a create element function that the first argument is like the name of the element that you're creating, and then the second or third is all of its children. So Vue actually converts your raw templates into a whole bunch of these functions that are much faster to inject into the DOM than straight like raw HTML strings. And that's why there's two versions of Vue, because there's one with just the runtime, and then there's also one with the compiler. Whenever you try and put your templates inside of these strings, Vue has to compile those. And if you're using Webpack, you can have Webpack do all of that compiling at build time. And so you can actually save a little bit on your bundle by using the runtime only when you're building. So that's why they don't use template here, so that they can completely omit the compiler and just use the runtime. And that's why they use the render function, so that you're not writing you're not writing your templates inside of strings. They're all converted into those render functions, if you will. Okay, so now let's look at app.vue. So there's a whole bunch of markup in here. We're seeing a little bit of interpolation. But the first thing you'll see is this template tag. And this is kind of part of these .vue files. A .vue file has it looks like an HTML file with 3 top-level elements. The first being template, which is where you write all of your markup. The second is a script tag, where you write all of your Vue.js code. And then the last is a style tag, where you write all of the styles for this component, which I'm a huge fan of this whole practice of writing our markup, our functional JavaScript, and all of our styling in a single file. It's a lot of an easier mental model for me to go about when I'm trying to actually create applications. And so that's a .vue file. And then what happens is at build time, Vue is going to convert all of this HTML into those render functions and pull the style, everything in between our style tags, pull that out and inject it as a style tag at runtime into our application. And then it just handles any transpiling that needs to happen in our script tag, and it gets shipped into our bundle as well. So you're dealing with the same kind of model that you were before. In the simple component, it's all just split out a little bit nicer. The main things that I wanted to touch on with inside of these Vue components is there's a couple of extra features that you can get when you use these, besides just the awesome split, or the splitting apart of your templates. You can actually use preprocessors inside of your templates. So has anyone ever heard of Pug before? Or Jade, maybe? You can use Pug or Jade right here inside your template by just saying lang equals Pug, and then it'll translate all of your Pug into HTML at build time. And then also, if we go down to like our style tag, we could set the lang equal to like Sass if we wanted to, or stylus, or less, or SCSS. And the only thing that you have to change when you do this is all you have to do is just install the Webpack loader for whatever you're trying to use. So if you're trying to use Pug, you would install the Pug loader, I think. Yeah, I think you'd install the Pug loader, and then you would also install like the core library. So you would install Pug. To use Sass, you would install Node Sass and the Sass loader. And that's all you have to do. Vue will take care of the rest in the build process. And then the other really awesome feature with using the .vue files is you can add a scoped attribute to your style tag, and all of the styles that you write in here will apply to this component and only this component. They'll never be interpreted by another component elsewhere. So I could just, if I had like this, if I wanted to style this h1 and only this h1 in my app, I could just use h1 like they're using in this example, and if I have the scoped attribute, it'll be scoped only to this component. Now, if we want to import another component into like our app component, it's pretty easy. We would just create a new .vue file, and we will scaffold this out real quick. And then inside of our component, inside our script tag, the first thing we would do is import that component. We would import the component, but that doesn't take care of everything because it's kind of outside of our the thing that we're exporting. So all you have to do now at this point is just add a components property to your Vue instance, where you specify where the key is the name of the component and how you would want to use it in your markup, and the value just being components. So for instance, if I wanted to use this component in my markup as my counter, I would set the key as my counter and then set that equal to that component that we just imported. And now inside of my markup up here, I would use my counter. Oh, it's pug, so it's not going to interpret it. I'll write it out. So I would use it in my HTML like this because I defined its key to be my counter. So whatever you define the key as is how you use it inside of your HTML. And then if you want the key to be the same name as the component itself, you could just use the cool ES6 or whatever destructuring, or I forget what they call that feature, but you can set the key and the value. If they're the same name, you can just write it once. So that's how you would add another component into this component. Righty. How are we doing for time? Okay, we still got a little bit more. Sweet. So now this is like I said, the simple version of Webpack, where there's just a Webpack config that takes care of everything for us. There's also another template called just Webpack. And we will okay, so that one is just Webpack on its own. First we did Webpack simple, now we're doing Webpack on its own, and it's going to ask us a few questions just like it did before, and then also it gives us the option to include the runtime and the compiler, or just the runtime, and I explained what the difference between those two. The runtime is like I think it says 6 kilobytes smaller. And I'm also going to show you how to use Vue router in this example, so we will make sure to include that. It also has some options for setting up some testing tools, but I'm not familiar with most of the testing tools in Vue. I know that there's several resources out there to take a look at them if you really want to try testing all of your Vue code. So I set it up without testing. All right, so this one's a little bit more complicated. There's a build folder and a config folder, and you don't have to edit these files very often, but it's essentially the entire build process as kind of like this little node application that uses Webpack, but it's just a lot more in-depth than the Webpack simple. And then this config, there's a couple different configurations in here that we can go in and edit if we need to do some special things in production versus development. This is where you would add those in if you need to modify the build process. There's also the Babel RC that we looked at before, a couple other configuration files, and our index.html, which looks the same as before. So once again, you write all of your components inside of Vue files. All of your Vue code goes inside of your JavaScript in here. So if we look at main.js, it's really similar to before, except we're also importing router. And if we jump into router real quick, it imports Vue, it imports the Vue router, and it imports one of our components that's defined right here. And whenever you import some kind of plugin, or you could call it an extension maybe to Vue, such as the Vue router, you have to tell Vue about it. It doesn't automatically register with Vue. And so that's what's happening right here with this Vue.use statement. Is the router is being registered with Vue, and then at registration time, Vue learns about any like global components that the Vue router registers. And then we just export a new router. And the router constructor or whatever takes an object literal where you define a routes array where each object in that array is an individual route. So a route has a path, which is the path to the route, a optional name property, and then a component. So right here we're saying the hello component, the hello world component is what should be rendered out when we go to / in our app. And then if we look in our app.vue, we have this div with an ID of app, and the reason that they're kind of wrapping this with a div, and I don't think I mentioned this kind of at the little intro thing I was doing, inside of Vue components, there has to be one top level element at all times. You can't, I could not remove this div right here and have that image and that special router Vue component sitting next to each other. It has to be wrapped in at least one parent element that covers everything. So at the top level, you can only have one element. But what's happening right here is this router Vue component, whichever component we define in our routes, whenever we visit that route, this router Vue gets replaced with that component. So if I was going to go in and define another route inside of here with a different component, then at that route we would have my other component instead of this hello world component inside of router Vue. So what you can do is define your navigation or maybe your footer inside of this app.vue component outside of router Vue, and then wherever you want your content to go, you just put the router Vue component. And let's just take a really quick look at that. So let's build out like a little navigation bar, and it'll also show us how to use the router link component, which is another component that the router adds. So if we say router link here, let's create just like a simple home page and an about page. So I'll say router link to / and this to is a prop that gets passed into the router that tells it into the router link component, which tells it where to go when you click on it. And we'll say like home page. Then we'll, oops, I don't want to delete that one. Say router link to like / about. And then if we come over here, I'm not going to use components. Instead, I'm going to maybe create like a pages folder. That's what I usually like to do when I'm doing this like single page app type stuff that you're using Vue Router for. We'll say homepage page.vue. And then we'll also say about page.vue. We'll scaffold those up. We'll just drop a little h1 with the name of the page. So we'll say about page scaffold home page. Okay, and then in our router, instead of importing this, we'll go ahead and import homepage from pages homepage.vue. Okay, and then we'll also import our about page, pages about page.vue. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and say instead of name is hello world, we'll just set it just to home, and set the component at this route to be homepage, and then we will, whoops. Register another route for our about page, or the name is about, and we're using that about page component. Okay, sweet. So now if I go ahead and, whoops. If I go ahead and run npm run dev, whoops, geez. Okay, if I run npm run dev, for both of the Webpack configurations, Vue just adds some npm scripts to run all of our Webpack processes. So there's dev, and we'll go ahead and open it up, and we have our home page, and then our about page, and that's the H1 that's being rendered out there is the only thing that's being swapped out in between each render. Another thing, it might be hard to see, but our URL has this hash in it, and that is to prevent when you use, it depends on how your web server is set up, but if you were using it without the hash, sometimes it'll try and hit your server first, especially if that's like the first route that your user's trying to visit. Well, it will hit the server first. If that's the first route that they're trying to hit. And you can remove the hash if you'd like. In some environments, you have to have that hash. For instance, in a Google Chrome extension, you would have to have that hash there. They wouldn't let you use use it without it. And to remove the hash if you need to, in the router configuration, you can set the mode to history. And the web server that Webpack comes with, the web server that Webpack comes with is already set up to handle this properly. But if I go ahead and just go to our main route and then go to /about, now the hash is not in there. So to toggle that, you just set mode to history. If you want the hash in there, you just leave it out. Okay. Alrighty.
So what happens if you come in hard on about?
It's going to hit your web server first. Well, I mean, it obviously has to hit your server, but it's gonna hit like a /about on your server. And so what you need to do is on your server, you would need to have like if you're using like a full web framework, like for instance Laravel, you would just need to like register those routes and have them all return the same Vue file. And then when all of your code hits the client side, it'll decide which component it needs to render when it looks at the route. Okay. So everything that I've used here, you can use with existing frameworks. If you want to like use this with Laravel, it's totally possible. And in fact, Laravel has like a different front-end build process kind of out of the box called Laravel Mix, and it has first-class support for all of this Vue stuff. So if you want to use Vue with Laravel Mix, it comes built into the framework when you first create a new application with Laravel. So that's a look at the router. Then there's another option if you don't want to use a different framework like Laravel or whatever. There's another option called Nuxt.js, and I'm not going to go super in-depth with Nuxt. I'm going to just kind of scaffold out a project really quick. And to create a Nuxt project, has anyone ever heard of Next.js? Next.js is kind of the same thing and was kind of the original in this type of project, but for React. Nuxt kind of took the same idea that Next created and brought it to Vue. So if I just say, go to the Nuxt website, we'll take a look at how to scaffold it up real quick. And to create a Nuxt project, you simply just use the Vue CLI. Something I didn't mention with the Vue CLI is that these templates, you can specify just a GitHub username and then a repository, and it'll look in that repository for a Vue.js scaffolding template. So your kind of wealth of templates is endless because anyone can put one on GitHub that anyone else can use. So in this scenario, we are actually using the Nuxt template to start up our Vue project. Okay, so if we go ahead and open this up, there's a lot more folders in here with Nuxt, but most of them are like configuration files. There's a configuration file for Nuxt itself. But the idea behind Nuxt is you use the the file tree to kind of, well, first kind of scaffold out like your routes file. So there's a pages folder, and every .vue file in this pages folder will be mapped to a route. So if I want an about page, I just create an about.vue file here, and now my application has an about page. And then the main thing that Nuxt does is it's kind of a framework for building, just straight single page applications. But when you're finished writing your code and you're ready to ship to production, you can run this generate command, which will use server-side rendering to render out all of your Vue components and have a whole bunch of just HTML files that contain all of your templates after they've been rendered. And so when you use this whole process of it's basically a static site generator using Vue. And the advantage of using that is because, I don't know if anyone else is familiar with building a lot of single page applications, but you have problems like, search engines not processing your JavaScript to get all the content of your site. And this kind of solves that problem by pre-rendering everything so that as crawlers and search engines and Facebook go through your site, they see the compiled output instead of just your, Vue templates, right? And the other advantage is it's really, when you use this pre-rendering, it's really fast for your users because they get all the rendered output right away instead of having to wait those few seconds maybe for Vue to boot up and go through all your templates and render everything out. So, and another thing is that Nuxt doesn't have a main entry point into your app that is accessible to you right away. The main thing you do is just write all of your routes inside, or all your pages in this pages folder. And since these are just pages, you might wonder how to do navigation and stuff that's outside of the pages. And that's all in this layouts folder. And a layout, it's another Vue template that you write out your navigation, maybe you have a sidebar, and then whenever you are ready to render out the kind of main content, you just put this little Nuxt component right there in place. So Nuxt is a static site generator for Vue that takes care of a lot of things for you if you're not trying to use an already existing framework. Okay, so that's, someone say something? Okay, so that's pretty much all that I have. If there are any questions, I have a few things that I could get into, but I did want to give a chance to answer anyone's questions. So, yes?
See that store folder there? Does that mean that it also incorporates Vuex?
It doesn't. I don't know if it comes. Let's look at the package JSON. I don't know if it has Vuex out of the box. No, it doesn't. But that's kind of the idea behind it, is that there's a place for your Vuex store to live inside this application. So yeah, that's exactly what that would be used for. Any other questions? Yes?
When you're doing your single page components,
Uh-huh.
and let's say you're layering on top of things, so let's say you maybe have a button that just does an Ajax call,
Mm-hmm.
and you load some stuff, but then you want to use it and customize it in a bunch of different ways
Uh-huh.
throughout your application. Do you use mixin? What's your approach?
Yeah, so I haven't run into that too often, but that's the whole idea behind mixins, which is not something that I mentioned. But mixins are a way to take a bit of functionality that it needs to be spread across lots of components and have that live in its own file, and then import it into the components that you need to.
Follow-up question: do you find that customized component, whenever you brought in your components, you gave it your name and then the component,
Mm-hmm.
can you do all that mix-in stuff just right there, or do I have to have a separate file that mixes everything together to make this specialized thing, and then use it, or can I just do it right where I need it?
I haven't used mixins very much, so I don't know, but I've seen a couple of examples, and if I'm remembering right, that's exactly how you would do it. Is just kind of your mixin code itself would live somewhere else so that it could be imported throughout your app, and then how to add it in is right there, and it's fairly easy to add in. But I haven't messed with mixins too much, so I would suggest checking out the Vue.js documentation, because their documentation is really good. That's not something I mentioned, but they do have really good docs. Yeah.
Another question: whenever you
So the cases where I use components the most are like the number one example I jump to is like a navigation bar. I always make a component for like my navigation bar and maybe another component for my footer, just so that they're separated. I don't end up creating components for tiny things like buttons. You know, I generally will just use the button tag and style it if I need to. And if it's styling that I need to copy to a bunch of other places, then maybe I'll put that into a component and do that. There's been a couple scenarios where like I've made like this, you know, custom like toggle switch that had a lot of elements inside of it, and that just made total sense to live in its own component, so that as I was reading the code, I just saw toggle switch instead of a whole bunch of divs that made everything look fancy. So I generally just do it when I'm trying to kind of make my code smaller. That's the like main scenario where I go to creating components, when I just want my code to be a lot smaller and more readable. Any other questions? Okay. How much more time? About time. Okay. All right. Well, that's pretty much it, unless anyone has any other questions. Right on. Thank you. There was one more thing that I was going to mention that I totally forgot. There is a GitHub repository. I think it's called like Vue Awesome, and it contains hundreds of links to just awesome stuff with Vue. Component libraries, you know, Ajax libraries, podcast episodes. There's lots of stuff in that repo, so check it out if you're wanting to learn more.